It only takes a little salt to change a loaf of bread. An act of peace can help to halt what violence seeks to spread. It only takes a mighty few who dare to take a stand to bring in justice, love, and truth to help a hurting land. It only takes a few to see and speak with prophet voice to challenge our complacency, to seek the better choice. Oh God, when troubles come, we pray, please won't you send those few? And then we hear the word you say, my church, I'm sending you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Joan Neal, and I serve as the Interim Executive Director here at Network. Welcome to our sixth discussion of white supremacy and American Christianity, fascism or faith. Judging from the numbers, once again, this seems to be a timely conversation. As of now, we have nearly 1,700 registrants and 10 co-sponsors. Thank you for your ongoing interest in this topic. As we begin, I want to acknowledge the beautiful hymn we just heard, offered to us by the composer, Carolyn Winfrey Gillette, who is the mother of one of our own teammates, Catherine Gillette, the vocalist, David Lamott, and Aaron Price on piano. We are truly grateful and blessed by your music. And now I am pleased to welcome Sister Robbie Pentecost, who will lead us in our opening prayer. Sister Robbie Pentecost is a member of the Sisters of St. Francis of Oldenburg, Indiana, and has served the Appalachian area for over 26 years, providing tools and resources for the empowerment of women and their communities. She is currently a member of her congregation's leadership team and has been a member of the network board for many, many years. Sister Robbie, please lead us in prayer.
Thank you, Joan and Network, for the invitation to offer prayer as part of this very important conversation. I am both honored and humbled by this opportunity. And thank you, Joan, for envisioning these conversations, and for Network and its various partners for making it possible to build community through them. Today's conversation comes at such a pivotal point in history. This conversation is deeply personal for all of us. It is times like this when our need for community is more evident. We are facing a potent ideology based on fear and hate, although veiled in Christian language. A few months ago, my own congregation encountered threads of white supremacy within our small town of 650 people, 100 of whom are sisters, after we announced the sale of 2 of our buildings on our mother house grounds. The boldness of a white nationalist wanting to promote the protection of white people's property, and the veiled threats against sisters for voicing their opposition to unjust policies on our own property makes real this moment we find ourselves in. It is a time such as this that we need each other to gather the courage, steadfastness, and persistence that our faith calls us to stand firm in the face of evil. So let us come together from our various corners of the world to seek together, to find encouragement, to be prodded and strengthened in our commitment to God's call to love. Let this time together nurture our hope that is in you, our Creator. And so we pray. All of us gathered together today, O God, and those who are with us in spirit can tell our stories of these past 7 months of deportations of loved ones and friends, lost jobs, or concerned that ours will be next, cuts to social safety nets or life-saving medical care. Some of us are just plain overwhelmed by the enormity of the challenges that await our response on so many levels at the same time. But our faith propels us, demands us, requires us, in the words of the prophet Micah. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. You tell us that we cannot sit on the sideline. What we know by faith is that when we come together as community in the name of our compassionate and merciful Creator, God is present in our midst. And we also know that nothing is impossible without God. So, in the words attributed to St. Francis of Assisi and adapted for this time, Lord, make us instruments of your peace and justice. Where there is hatred, oppression, undeserved imprisonment, lack of respect for the humanity of one another, enactment of unjust policies, racism, and genocide, help us to sow love through justice in our words, our hearts, and by our actions. Where there is injury, abuse of authority, advancement of policies that stand against the common good, please give us pardon for our paralysis because of the frustration and anger we hold, and then propel us to move forward into action on behalf of the common good. Where there is doubt, fear of the future, or sense of confusion, give us faith, which has arms for offering a warm embrace, hands for helping each other, and feet for standing firm in our values. Where there is despair, give us a vibrant hope rooted in community that believes nothing is impossible with our God. Where there is darkness, violence, lies, selfishness, give us the light to see reality around us, speak truth to power. And where there is sadness, hurt, and pain, help us sow seeds of joy rooted in justice, faith, and community. O Divine Master, grant that we may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen.
Thank you, Sister Robbie, for that wonderful prayer. Well, my friends, over the last 3 years in our previous conversations, we learned about the corrosive, blasphemous ideology of Christian nationalism and how it has developed in our country and taken a firm hold over time. These last 5 conversations have been a fascinating dialogue that both educated us and enlightened us to the clear and present danger of our country and our democracy. Today, we are going to broaden the conversation to also look at fascism as a growing threat to our democratic way of life. And I think this discussion will prove to be similarly stimulating. But before we get started, I want to level set so that we are sure that we are all on the same page with regard to our terminology. Let's just briefly review definitions of Christian nationalism and fascism. Christian nationalism is the idolatrous belief that the United States was founded as a Christian nation, that God ordained America to be a promised land for white Christians, that our laws should be based on Christian values, and that one must be a Christian in order to be a real American. Adherents to this ideology believe that the federal government should declare the United States a Christian country, and that where Christian values and laws differ, the Bible should prevail. Christian nationalists do not believe in pluralism or religious freedom. The other important ingredient in Christian nationalism as it exists here in the United States is its connection with white supremacy. From the founding of the country by white European settlers, the idea of the superiority of white skin has been a foundational concept. The European settlers believed themselves to be superior. They believed, as the doctrine of discovery encouraged, that God had intended white Christian males, particularly, to dominate the society that grew up in this country. White Christian nationalism has been around in the United States since its founding, and whether or not we see it, it has definitely influenced our communities and our churches. Fascism is a mass political movement and a system of governance marked by centralization of authority under a dictator. It's typically a capitalist economy subject to stringent government controls, violent suppression of the opposition, and typically a policy of extreme nationalism and racism. This model of governance stands in stark contrast to liberal democracies that support individual rights, competitive elections, and political dissent. Fascism is marked by the overthrow of existing systems of government and persecution of political enemies, while championing traditional values and alignment with powerful business interests. Does any of this remind you of anything in our country today? Well, to unpack all of this, I am pleased to once again be joined by my two favorite conversation partners on this topic, Father Brian Massengale and Dr. Robert P. Jones. Welcome, Robbie and Brian.
Oh, thanks, Joan. Glad to be here.
Good to be with you again, Joan.
Great. So, Father Brian Massengale is the James and Nancy Buckman Chair in Applied Christian Ethics at Fordham University, a national and international leader in the field of theological ethics, a scholar activist, and the author of Racial Justice and the Catholic Church, as well as numerous articles and publications, presentations, and award-winning commentaries on racism and other social justice issues, including a fuller inclusion of the LGBTQ community. Dr. Robert P. Jones is president and founder of the Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI, a nonprofit and nonpartisan research organization that looks at the nexus of religion, culture, and politics. Robbie is also the author of many books, including his award-winning recent book entitled The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future, which is a work that helps us to understand how deep the roots of white Christian nationalism go. Robbie also writes a weekly free newsletter, which you can find at www.whitetolong.net on Substack. So, Brian and Robbie, as you know, and I've just spoken about, the profile of Christian nationalism in this country has surely been raised in the recent past, particularly since the first election of the current president in 2016. Throughout this most recent campaign and in the last 6 months, we have seen how Christian nationalism not only propelled him to electoral victory, but is manifestly evident in the ways he has led, the policies he has employed, and that this Congress has pursued, and the people that he has surrounded himself with. So I thought we might begin with checking in about the level of tolerance of Christian nationalism in our country today, and what that means for the acceptance of an autocratic form of government like fascism rather than democracy. Robbie, tell us what you're seeing in your surveys regarding the country's openness to the ideology of Christian nationalism. And then tell us a little bit about what the seeming increase in the number of people who are willing to say out loud that democracy no longer works and we should try something else, like maybe a strong man. Talk to us.
Yeah, well, thanks, Joan. So Father Massengale, so glad to be back with you as well. I can't believe we've done 6 of these. This is the 6th conversation over, what, 3 years, I think?
Yeah.
And so one of the things that struck me is how we've been talking about these topics, and the context has been shifting out from under us as we've been talking about these. So it was, I think, a conversation when we began these about preventing the kind of take over the country by Christian nationalism, right? And now we find ourselves in a place where that vision is very much in power. Before I get to some numbers, I thought I'd just begin with 2 images. So I've just come from St. Louis, where I was with the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship group there, a group that's very much dedicated to the work of racial justice, diversity, and equity and inclusion, in practicing their Baptist faith. And they send greetings. I told them I was coming, so they send greetings to this group as here. And it struck me when I was there, our hotel was right near the Arch in St. Louis, right? And it is also near the Basilica of St. Louis, right? There's right on the river, right on the Mississippi River. I actually took a photo. You can, if you get the right angle, you can see the Basilica steeple underneath the Arch in St. Louis. And there's a way in which, speaking of how old this kind of struggle is in the country. I mean, of course, the Arch was originally called the Jefferson's Westward Expansion Arch, right? And it is a symbol of manifest destiny. It was literally the portal through which people envisioned, right, the march of white Christian civilization from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And St. Louis at the time, right, was newly purchased, rights to conquest from France, right, and with the Louisiana Purchase. And that juxtaposition of this cross and the Basilica steeple has a globe and a cross on top of it, right, with this, so this kind of sense of the cross over the globe and conquest, and then this symbol of manifest destiny. We've been struggling with this idea for a very long time, right, in this country. And I was just feeling how that in that same block area is also the courthouse, where enslaved people were auctioned off in the shadow of the church. Like you could see the church from the old courthouse. They're all within a block of each other. And so all of that, right, is kind of part of our legacy and part of a struggle, I think, to realize a more faithful version of Christianity and democracy in this country. And then the other thing I just can't help but mention is that just this weekend, we have in the Minnesota State Capitol, lying in state, State Representative Melissa Hortman and her husband, who were politically assassinated in this country. Like it is so clear this was a political assassination, and it was, and I think that this has not been covered that well. It was motivated by Christian nationalism. The profile of the person who was the shooter, the murderer. He's been in Africa preaching Christian nationalism and spiritual warfare and Christian domination. Right, that's the worldview that pulled the trigger. That is in our lifetime, right? This political assassination. So it's so very old and so very present with us at the same time, right? And so I think it's just so stark, and the cost of it are so very present with us. So I'll just give you a couple numbers, and I'll turn it over to Brian just to kind of level set here. When we ask about this worldview, the good news is that by a margin of 2-1, Americans reject this vision of Christian nationalism, right? So it's only about a third of the country, about 3 in 10 actually of the country, who affirm these ideas that yes, U.S. law should be based on the Bible. The U.S. is a Christian nation. You can't be truly American unless you're Christian. Like those kinds of ideas. It's only about 3 in 10 Americans that really embrace that worldview. More than 6 in 10 that reject it. However, there are the groups that are more likely to embrace that worldview are white Christian groups, and in particular white evangelical groups. About 2/3 of them embrace that worldview. And it's notable that if you look at the Catholics, there's a big difference between white and non-white Catholics on this view as well. White Catholics are more likely, they look about like the national population, right around 3 in 10 white Catholics, but that number drops again to only about a quarter of Hispanic Catholics. So you can kind of see some differences there in embracing that, in really embracing that worldview that highly correlates with authoritarianism and fascism, as you described it. So I'll turn it over to Brian with that.
Brian, any comments about just what Robbie's told us about the level of acceptance in our country of this ideology of Christian nationalism, and particularly among Catholics? And I have more to talk to you about in that regard later.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I've got a whole lot to say about Catholics. But anyway, it's good to be with you and with Robbie again. It seems like, yeah, we've been doing this for a while. And now we've been trying to warn people about what was coming. And now here we are. And I'm going to resist the temptation to say we told you so, but we did. And I think part of the ongoing challenge of this work is getting people to listen, to pay attention, and take it seriously. And why is there such resistance? I've been thinking to myself, why have Catholics supported this movement? Or another way of putting it, why haven't Catholics been more vocal in their opposition to what's been going on in the country in the last 6 or 7 months? And two things I want to offer, and we'll unpack them as we go along, I'm sure. The first we have to remember, as Robbie said, this is not a new struggle. This is a new iteration, a new manifestation, but it's not a new struggle. And we need to recall that standing against racism has never been a major badge of Catholic communal identity. Black activism has long been held suspect. We look at who's in the religious leadership, who's allowed to be in religious leadership in our country. The paucity, the scarcity of Black priests, Black bishops, Black religious. This didn't just happen. It happened because we didn't want Black people to be seen as invested with sacred authority, being able to speak God. And so the church has been deeply complicit in this. But a second thing I think I need to put forward, and which really speaks to the present moment, is that the Catholic Church in this country, at least officially, has always framed their political participation and concerns principally in opposition to abortion and LGBTQ equality. Other issues were deemed as not preeminent. Remember that phrase from the political responsibility document. And therefore, they get an effective pass. And I think we also need to understand, as you alluded to, Joan, when you began, is that fascism deeply aligns with traditional gender roles, with traditional sexual morality. And so if the Catholic hierarchy and the Catholic Church institutionally defines its political priorities in terms of traditional sexual morality and the reassertion of traditional gender roles, this is going to lead to a muted opposition at best to what's been going on in our country. There's going to be a deep sense of symbiosis between what is happening in our country and the concerns or the priorities, the preeminent priorities that have been outlined by our Catholic bishops. And so I think we see that we've seen, with very few exceptions, the bishops have not spoken out as forcefully as they should in defense of the immigrants. Now, there are a few exceptions, but they've not spoken out really forthrightly in that cause. And when they do, they always temper it by first praising the Trump administration's policies when it comes to LGBTQ issues. And so I think what we see here is that fascism historically has always been aligned with the reassertion of traditional sexual and gender morality, and those issues have been identified as the preeminent ones for Catholic participation and discernment in the public square. And so when you put all that together, it creates this very troubling dynamic where Catholics, even if only 3 out of 10 white Catholics subscribe to the ideology of white Christian nationalism, the Catholic Church as an institution finds itself mute in regard to any kind of effective opposition.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can I just add one thing here? Just think it'll help. I mean, the other, the only, I think I mentioned this before, but the only post-mortem piece I wrote about the election was a piece I wrote at Time, and I titled it "What White Christians Have Wrought."
Yes.
Because the thing that was so striking to me is that even with everything we know about this, about the MAGA movement, about the Trump regime, the things he was promising to do, he's not doing anything he didn't promise he was going to do. And yet people still voted. And I think the thing that was so striking to me is that even knowing everything, the votes of white Christians across the board did not diminish in this last election, right? So we had, I mean, everybody kind of knows the number. I think that white evangelical Christians, voted 8 and 10, right, for Trump. But what people forget is that like white Catholics voted 6 and 10 for Trump, and white mainline Protestants voted 6 and 10. The non-evangelical end of the white Protestant world voted 6 and 10 for Trump. And I think that the soul searching piece, particularly in the Catholic context, I was looking at our recent polling where we asked about the favorability of at the Trump 100-day mark of the Trump regime. Like how do people think about Trump and what he's doing? There is a real soul searching, I think, that particularly in the Catholic world, because Catholics are holding together a kind of people in church across racial lines in a way that Protestant churches typically don't. Right. So I think that this is what's really stark and really it sticks out to me is that if you look at like the favorability of Trump at the 100-day mark, white Catholics are still 53% favorable to everything they're seeing Trump do at the 100-day mark. If you look at Catholics of color, it's 25%. It's half that. And kind of what I've said, in the Protestant world as well, is that, look, exactly what you said, Brian. I mean, for Christians who look like me, our track record on these issues, immigration, white supremacy, racial justice, is atrocious. It's shameful. And one thing I've been calling on like white Christians to do, Catholic and Protestant alike, is like, look, if we find ourselves at odds with our fellow Christians of color, we should pump the brakes, because we have been on the wrong side of history, on the wrong side of the gospel on so many times. If we had just listened, right, it would have made a huge amount of difference. And here, when you've got, a quarter of Catholics of color saying, yeah, okay, but 3/4 of Catholics of color saying no to this, and you've got a majority of white Catholics saying yes to this, that's a conversation that ought to be, a really serious one in Catholic circles.
Oh, absolutely. And another thing to add to that is that the level of white support for Trumpism, I think we've learned with Donald Trump, we take ourselves off the hook. But Trumpism is that his support for white Catholic support for Trumpism and for the ideology of white Christian nationalism has increased at every election. He's increased over 2016, 2020, and 2024. So we see this. So now we get to this 6 and 10 figure. You're absolutely right. And I think it really indicts the fact that for most white Catholics, the church has functioned in a way to reinforce their religious world, reinforces their political ideology and their racial identity, rather than saying that in our Christian identity should define us fundamentally. We basically have created a religious system that reinforces people's racial identities over their religious loyalties, or they define their religious loyalties in terms of their religious faith.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that um, in the Catholic world, there's a real question that is before us in terms of what our actual beliefs are relative to what the church has taught over these last, thousands of years. Brian, I want to just ask a little bit about what you make of the number of Catholics that are in so many high positions in this administration, as well as in the Supreme Court, which, of course, gave us really terrible decisions yesterday. But I want to just take a moment and name some of those people who are in these high positions. People like Tom Homan, the Director of Homeland Security and the author and enforcer of the cruel, illegal snatching and disappearing of so many people, including immigrants who have legal status, those who are children of U.S. citizens, and even some U.S. citizens themselves. And what about Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Secretary of Health and Human Services Robert Kennedy, Sean Duffy, Secretary of Transportation, John Ratcliffe, Director of the CIA, Linda McMahon, Secretary of Education, Kash Patel, Director of the FBI, and more. And of course, the most famous, Vice President J.D. Vance. And then you look at all the Catholics on the Supreme Court. What is happening here? I mean, in addition to that, Steve Bannon and all the other advisors and the Catholics, Leonard Leo, who are the backers in the Napa Institute. What is happening in Catholicism that Catholics can take public positions like this in this administration and pursue an agenda that is so antithetical to our faith?
That's a great question. Let me begin by making I don't mean this to be light, but I think one of the blessings of the papal conclave we just had, and with the election of Robert Prevost, Pope Leo XIV, as the first, U.S. American to hold that office, is that it means that J.D. Vance is not the most prominent Catholic on the global scene anymore. So at least we can be grateful for that. The Holy Spirit was working.
Amen.
But now a more serious answer to your question is this, and that is, unfortunately, this is not new. When we look at previous fascist regimes, we've seen them be in ascendancy in Italy and in Spain. And both of these were deeply Catholic countries.
Mm-hmm.
So Catholicism in and of itself doesn't give you an immunity to the allure of a fascist appeal, to extreme nationalist appeals. Now, why is that? I think we have to, again, look and see that at its roots in American Catholicism, we have never mastered the skills of how to talk effectively about race and racial justice as being essential to Catholic identity.
Yes.
It simply isn't. And so what we've got instead, for most white Catholics, racial justice is seen as somehow extra credit, if even that. In other words, it's a nice thing, but it's not an essential part of their Catholic identity. And again, we have some research for this. Not to mention another polling organization, but the Pew Research study of Black Catholicism found out that 75% of Black Catholics see opposition to racism as being the most important or significantly important a part of their faith and their faith expression.
Mm-hmm.
We don't see that reflected at all in white Catholics. And so with the result then, as long as you're willing to give, again, at least rhetorical lip service to being pro-life, at least in terms of being anti-abortion, that's enough to make you Catholic. And this is the reason why the litany of people that you've mentioned there can be Catholic, call themselves Catholic, and have prominent faith leaders, supporting this movement. I mean, we have to remember that was a Catholic cardinal who prayed at President Trump's inauguration.
Yes.
And we also have to remember that in many of our metropolitan archdioceses in Los
Oh, wow.
Angeles, in New York, of their Catholic flock are people who are immigrants or people who are living in households who have mixed immigration status, who are particularly vulnerable right now. Even Archbishop Gomez in Los Angeles had to say, look, my churches are emptied. People are afraid to go to church now because, again, ISIS said that they're no longer respecting churches as being a place of sanctuary, that they will conduct raids even outside of churches. And so I think that, but again, even with that, you do not find the USCCB raising its voice in the kind of full-throated denunciation and defense of their own flock. That tells you, and again, Robbie is absolutely right here, is that I think the grace of this moment, if there is a grace, is that it's a moment of stark clarity. That white Christianity and white Catholicism are being called to a deep examination because now it's crystal clear what they stand for and what they don't stand for. And as you said, fascism or faith, this is absolutely antithetical to the gospel of Jesus Christ. It always has been. But the grace of this moment is that now that question is being called in a very clear and stark way that is completely unavoidable.
And can I just add to that too, Brian? I mean, just to make this really clear too. And the divide between white and Catholics and Catholics of color is, I think, more stark because now the Catholic Church is only 55% white in this country, right? It's 45% people of color. And so these big divisions, it's not just like there's an overwhelming group of white people over here and this tiny little, group of non-white people over here. We're talking about almost an even split now between white and non-white Catholics. I mean, so this is a real identity crisis, I think, for the Catholic Church in this country.
And not only that, but when you look at the demographics, that non-white portion of the Catholic Church is the youngest part of the Catholic
and growing.
Church.
That's right.
It's growing and it's young. I mean, this is Catholicism of the future. And if we cannot come out and defend their family, defend their right to a family life, which is the fundamental value in Catholic social teaching, if we can't defend their human dignity, which is the foundation of Catholic social teaching, that people remember that. And it's not by accident that we're seeing an erosion, an attrition, what I call an exodus of Catholics of color out of the Catholic Church. That again, the Pew study showed that almost half of Black folks who were raised Catholic no longer associate themselves with the Catholic Church, and precisely over this inability of the Church to be a forthright witness for justice, especially for racial justice, for justice for the immigrant. Again, by defining ourselves solely, our political loyalties and participation solely in terms of anti-abortion and solely in terms of anti-LGBTQ legislation, then we tie ourselves so closely to a movement which is completely hostile to the life and the dignity of the majority of the Church's future.
Yeah.
And can we just say too on this point, sorry, just one more quick thing because I want to lose this thread. That we should really say it clearly here that the current iteration of the Republican Party under Donald Trump is not a pro-life party in the way that is traditionally defined. Trump actually moved the Republican Party away from the pro-life position. Like, first of all, there was no party position at all his first time around. This last time he watered it down. It's no longer right asking for a constitutional amendment or any of that stuff. Right. It's not that. And I think that's a tell. Right.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? Oh, absolutely.
Right. And again, to your point, sorry, John, but again, to your point, and that is, Trump has never been a pro-life president.
Yeah.
Never. Okay, you cannot separate children from their parents at the border and throw them in cages. There are still children from his first administration who have not been reunited with their families because they never bothered to take their names down. They never intended for them to be reunited. That kind of cruelty, that kind of inhumanity cannot be called pro-life by any stretch of the imagination. His glee in reinstating the federal death penalty, that is not reconcilable being pro-life. And so I think we need to understand and call very clear, and sending immigrants, even if you're going to deport them, but to deport them without due process and to send them to countries where you know they're going to be abused, such as in El Salvador or in South Sudan. I mean, this is not pro-life. And I think we need to say that very, very clearly as a Catholic Church, that at best, people have been duped into thinking that he's pro-life.
Yeah.
But at worst, we've been blind, and we've been deliberately blind and turned a blind eye to his flagrant disregard for the dignity, for his respect to the equal dignity of every human life.
And that is a challenge not only just to our Christian faith, whether we're talking Catholics or evangelical Protestants or mainline Protestants. It is a challenge for our country and for our democracy. I think the picture of Christianity that the two of you have painted here, which is also a picture of demographics, is the challenge of this democracy and whether or not it continues to be a democracy, or maybe looks like something a little like fascism. And so let's turn a little bit to that discussion of fascism. And I mentioned earlier that Christian nationalism is considered a pillar of fascism because when you capture people's religious beliefs, research tells us that it's so much easier to gain their support for other illiberal actions. So talk a little bit about what the signs of, we've mentioned some of them, but what are the signs of fascism that are beginning to appear in our country? And Robbie, you may even have some, questions that you ask that illuminate the fact that some people in this country are willing to go down the road of this kind of authoritarian form of governance.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. We have asked about this, and what we find is that support for Christian nationalism, support for authoritarianism, and frankly, support for the MAGA movement all fit hand in glove. They're highly, highly correlated worldviews. If you support one, you're inevitably likely to support the other. We find about 4 in 10 Americans fit a kind of authoritarian profile support. And, we're asking, things like, we need a president who is willing to break the rules if that's what it takes to set things right. If they disagree with the courts, they should just ignore them, like those kind of moves. And even we're asking about those things. Again, we have about nearly 4 in 10 Americans, and it is again the same pattern. It is white Christians who are more likely to support those views than others. So I think it's quite important that we kind of pay attention to this. And I was thinking about fascism, and I should just confess, like during Trump's term, first term, I was reluctant to use the word fascism. I thought it might be a stretch too far. I don't believe that anymore. It's a term that comes certainly out of kind of this early part of the 20th century of these movements, as Brian described, in Europe, in Germany, in Italy. And so it has that historical precedent. But if you take it even out of that context, there are these marks of it, right? And we see almost all of them right here. Even during Trump's first term, I wrote about Trump's appeal, particularly to white Christians, over nostalgia. Yeah. And that is a powerful, powerful drug, right? Disillusionment and nostalgia. And if you remember, like when he talks about the country, he talks about our country as a failing country. And then he sets himself up as the savior of this failing country. And we used to be great. It's like it's a Catholic audience, so I can use the word triptych, right? It is this kind of 3-paneled thing. And on the left panel is nostalgia, right? For a lost past. In the middle panel is crisis, right? Where we are right now. It's the present and it's crisis. And in the sort of panel on the right is the golden age that we are being led into by the great leader, right? And so that's kind of the fascist formula. And all of us should be recognizing, boy, that's right here with us right now, right? This even talks about a great golden age every time he posts, right? In all caps, a great golden age. And, whenever he talks about the country, we are in crisis. Half the things that he has done in this administration by executive order, he has done by declaring a fake emergency.
That's right.
And Congress has let him do that. A fake economic emergency to get the tariffs going, a fake alien invasion, right? To kind of go with these kind of illegal detainment and mass deportations. It's all because if you were a fascist leader, you need the crisis, right? To run roughshod over the Constitution, to run roughshod over, and this is where I think Christians really have to be in play. The other thing that gets run over is our sense of empathy, our sense of solidarity, and our sense of basic decency, right? That gets run, because if we're really in crisis, we have to set all that stuff aside, right? To solve the immediate problem. And I think that's where we have to stand up and say, oh, actually, no, right? We're not going to shelve empathy. We're not going to shelve our humanity just because you've said there's this emergency.
And it's an emergency that you have created by the things that you have created.
Right.
So, yeah.
And not only that, but there's also an act of denigration of compassion and empathy. I'm forgetting the public official who basically said that that's the problem that we have. And I think that's the other.
Yeah, Musk talked about we're committing like a suicide because of empathy in this.
Because of empathy, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's the deepest danger about how does this become fascism, is that, remember, one of the core parts of fascism is a suppression of dissent, the suppression of disagreement. And we've seen that, and why Catholics and Christians should be particularly concerned about this is that it's not only the suppression of political dissent, it's also the active suppression of religious voices that raise a dissenting position. In other words, they want to control what counts as authentic religious faith, what counts as authentic Christianity. Recall that it was in April that the Naval Academy purged 381 books from its library. And among them were not just books that gave a political analysis of white supremacy, but also a faith-based analysis of white supremacy. Among them being Robbie Jones's book, among them being my book on the racial justice in the Catholic Church, and Thea Butler's book on evangelical Christianity. But what's going on here is not the suppression of a political point of view. It's the suppression of a religious point of view. And what they're basically saying is that in America, and like, for example, in my book, I quote Saint Pope John Paul II. They're saying that there is no place for a Saint John Paul II if that voice contradicts the voice of white Christian nationalism. And so I think what we're seeing in fascism, and I think people need to be alert to this, is it's not simply, it would be bad enough if it suppressed political dissent. And we're seeing this now, roughhousing of political leaders, the manhandling of a U.S. senator in California, and Trump said, because he looks like an illegal. So let that sink in for a while. This is here. But the other part of fascism is that it has no respect for religious freedom. It has no respect for religious liberty. I don't care if the president does have a commission on religious liberty. It is not a respecter of religious liberty if those voices contradict its agenda. And I think we need to understand this, because one of the things that Trump benefits from is the belief that it can't happen here in America.
Yeah.
That it can't happen in America. We could never do that. So when people use the word fascism, we're seen as extremists, we're seen as alarmists or whatever. No, we need to understand that This was not an idle action in the Naval Academy. In fact, they talk about this is supposed to be a prototype so that any institution of higher education or any educational institution that receives federal funding cannot have books like Robbie's or mine in its library. In other words, this is not simply about suppressing political dissent. It's also about the policing of religious values. And I think we need to understand this and understand this clearly.
I think that's
Yeah,
right.
I think it's
And
right, Brian. There's no doubt in my mind that Trump's, task force on anti-Christian bias is going to come after the wrong kinds of Christians under the banner of that, by their lights, the wrong kinds of Christians and the wrong kinds of Christians. You're absolutely right. Also, that was a test run at the Naval Academy. It's not the end. It was a warm up there. And, near where I live, we just have seen the president of the University of Virginia, right? One of the most prominent public institutions in the country has been forced to resign under pressure. It's also the houses, by the way, one of the best religious studies programs at a public university in the country. Right. And, if we believe they're not going to come for Notre Dame, they're not going to come for Fordham, they're not going to come for Georgetown, we are deeply mistaken.
I just gave a presentation to the Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities presidents, and I made that very point. I said, this is a moment when we need to stand up very clearly and enunciate our right to profess our faith, because they will not allow a faith that believes in the equal human dignity of every human person. They will not allow that faith to be practiced, because that is absolutely antithetical to their political goals and their political aims. And so they have no respect for religious liberty. That commission is a fig leaf for the advancement of one particular Christian ideology, so-called Christian ideology. And in that kind of America, there is no place for Judaism, except for the most extreme forms of Zionist belief. There is no room for Islam of almost any kind. There is no room for a genuine multi-faith America. And there is no room for genuine Catholicism. There is no room for the values that most religious women's congregations profess in America. There is no room for Catholic social teaching in that kind of America. And when I'm speaking this way, I do mean to raise the alarm, because I don't think people really see this. The Trump administration has been very good at distracting us by putting little things out there. We're always distracted by the crisis of the moment. And he phrases this all under the banner being against DEI. This is not about a public policy. This is not about opposition to a public policy of DEI. This is about the creation of a movement of a country where there is no room for political or faith-based opposition. That's what this is about.
Yeah,
and all to the advancement of the rule, the dominance of white Christian cisgendered straight men as being the will of God. And I think that white women need to wake up to this as well, because remember that he fired the black 4-star general who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he fired the first woman admiral who was the chief of naval operations, not because they were incompetent, not because they were unqualified, but because they do not believe that diversity is a strength. Yeah. Or in the words of the acting Secretary of State, competent white men must be in charge if we want to get things done. That's a direct quote.
It certainly is. And all of this, writ large, is really the goal of controlling institutions in general, not just the church, not just the religious community, but and you've both spoken about it, but the educational institutions, Harvard, really
Yes.
staid and firm institutions in our country, which need then for their power to actually be ensconced, need to be you know, brought in under control. So I think this is a pattern. And what I appreciate about the dialogue that we're having now is our attempt to really connect the dots for people. There are all of these things that are happening around us, and we can look here and say, oh my gosh, that's a terrible thing that just happened. And over here, that's another terrible thing that just happened. But what we need is to be able to see why those two things are connected. And this whole idea of the possibility of our country walking away from or being led away from a liberal democracy into a fascist form of governance is the goal here. And so I appreciate the conversation that we are having. So I have one sort of last question. And now that we've, talked about all of the things that we should be concerned about, all of the threats, what should we embrace as signs of hope? And Brian, you mentioned earlier that, the fact that we have some clarity about this moment is potentially a sense of hope, because as long as we know what we're facing, we have the ability to push against it. So what other signs would you say that there are that our democracy is still alive and can possibly survive these attacks?
I'll take a stab at this because I think that, again, in our opening song that we used at the beginning, it said that only 3.5% can make a difference, and basically we're talking about the biblical parable of the leaven and the dough, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And so I took my calculator out and I said, what would 3.5% of the American population be? And the American population is what, 230 million? It means you need a little over 8 million people. And we had not quite 8 million, but according to press recounts, we had about upwards to 5 million people who came out on June 14th, the No King's Day, to protest the fact that this is not what we want in America. That is a sign of hope. The fact that, Robbie began with the statistics saying that only 30% of the country are committed to this MAGA ideology. That's a sign of hope there. Now, unfortunately, they're all concentrated in one political party, and that political party is dominant, and the other political party is still flailing and trying to find a strategy. But at least we know the numbers are there to mount a significant political movement. The other sign of hope is that people are beginning to wake up to the danger that is here.
Mm-hmm.
I think that when, again, Americans, when it hits our pocketbooks, then it gets real. And I think as people learn more and more about what's coming with this budget, with this big, beautiful bill, so-called, people are realizing I'm going to lose my health care. I won't be able to feed my family. It's one thing to say, well, these things need to hurt in the abstract. When it comes down to me and my mother can't feed herself, my father can't access dialysis. I mean, this is what we're talking about here. As that becomes real, that creates an opportunity. But the other thing I think we need to do is we need to find ways to muster people's courage and to help them realize that they're not alone. Because it's okay to be afraid. I mean, if you're not afraid right now, there's something wrong with you. But courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is the ability to not be mastered and controlled by your fear. And I think that's what they want us to feel. They want us to feel isolated. They want us to feel alone. They want us to feel that this is so overwhelming, it's inevitable. Because when we succumb to the fact that this is inevitable, then they win. And I think what the greatest challenge for us as a faith-based movement is to continually let people know you are not alone. You are not alone. We are not alone. I think we need to underscore that over and over and over again, because fear and paralysis thrive when we feel isolated and overwhelmed. We are not alone. And I think if we can get that message out there, that can really be a powerful sign of hope and resistance.
Robbie, anything to add?
Oh, it's always dangerous going after the man who stands in the pulpit a lot. For the closer, but just a couple. It's funny, Brian. I was going to go back to the 3.5% too. That's why I don't know if you saw me smiling.
I did see you smiling. Yeah,
I was thinking exactly the same thing. And that number, by the way, comes from social science research. That's what they found. In countries where there has been these authoritarian fascist movements, the tipping point tends to be about 3.5% of the population showing up in nonviolent protests. That tends to be enough to kind of break the spell. And so I think you're right to point to the No King's Day and other things around the country of where people are finding their voice, people are finding their feet, they're willing to kind of stand up. Here's the thing. The longer we are into this regime, the harder that is going to be. So the sooner we can stand up and the louder we can be, the better, right? That's that. So I think that's the, I've heard some people, well, we've got an election, coming up, next year, but I don't know where we'll be if we sit around on our hands between now and the election. So it is about like find your lane, find something local. And I'm heartened by the fact that there's 1,700 people registered for this conversation in the middle of summer vacations and everything else on a weekend that people have other things to do. That means there is an appetite. There's a conviction. There's a sense that this is not the way we want it to go. I've always been suspicious. I'll end with this point of, I know that King said it and others have said it, this kind of the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice. The reason I'm always like kind of wince at that is because it seems to imply on the face of it that somehow it just cosmically happens, right? Right. But we are the ones who bend the arc. Like we are the ones. And so I think that's the thing to remember, that like, if we're Christian, we are sort of doing it in prayer. We are doing it in solidarity with others. And we are certainly relying on the Spirit to sustain us, right, in Christian terms. But it is us. It's up to us to do that. And so I think that's the thing I would leave us for, is that one, yes, we are in fact facing, like, I think when people write about this period in our history, they're going to write about it like 1933 Germany. It is a turning point. It is a hinge point. And when the people, the history and like, where were people? There's going to be the same kind of, there's going to be the kind of enablers. There's going to be the resistors, and there's going to be the big bunch of people who are complacent in the middle. And I think the more of us we can decide, no, we're going to be on the side of justice. We're going to be on the side of resistors. That's where we want our name to be on the wall when the history books kind of look back at this moment.
Amen to that, Robbie. I think you did as well as the person who's in the pulpit a lot. Well, thank you both. You are both bright lights in this struggle and in this time of darkness that we find ourselves in our country and in our Christian faith. It is always such an honor to be engaged in conversation with you, and I hope that we will be able to continue to hear from you and to be inspired by your leadership in this area. Once again, we leave this space not just with an understanding, a better understanding of what we're really facing right now, but also with a modicum of hope that as we continue to make our way through these treacherous times, there is a real opportunity for us to come out of this better than perhaps we are today, and certainly better than our past. So thank you both for joining us, and we'll look forward to what else you have to say going forward.
Thank you, Joan. And as always, Robbie, it's always good to be in dialogue with you. Thank you.
Yeah, you too. Thank you.
Well, what a stimulating conversation. So we've now heard about how Christian nationalism and fascism are growing threats to our democracy and our Christian faith. But that also does leave us asking the question, what can we do about all of this? Now, or next, I should say, we're going to hear about some concrete steps that we can take to resist and potentially end Christian nationalism, which will greatly reduce the threat of our slide into authoritarianism. Our next guest is another great friend and partner of Network, Amanda Tyler, Executive Director of the Baptist Joint Committee on Religious Freedom and lead organizer for Christians Against Christian Nationalism. Amanda is a constitutional law expert and a theological scholar who is deeply committed to her Baptist faith, to religious freedom, and to the maintenance of our liberal democracy. She is convinced that together we can overcome the dangerous ideology of Christian nationalism, which is a threat to our democracy and our Christian faith. Unfortunately, Amanda could not be with us in person today, but graciously agreed to a recorded conversation. I had the privilege of sitting down with her yesterday. So let's watch and listen to her tell us about how to end Christian nationalism. See myself. Okay. So I'm here today with Amanda Tyler, Executive Director of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Freedom and lead organizer for Christians Against Christian Nationalism. Amanda is an attorney and an expert on issues of religious freedom and, of course, Christian nationalism and what to do to stop it. In fact, Amanda's new book entitled How to End Christian Nationalism is a primer on the ways in which we as individuals and communities can stop this dangerous ideology. Welcome, Amanda, and thank you for making the time for this conversation.
Oh, it's wonderful to have this conversation with you, Joan. Thanks for inviting me to be a part of your conference.
Great. So let's just get right into it then. So you launched Christians Against Christian Nationalism around 6 years ago, and you've been organizing the effort to fight back for a very long time. Tell us why you did that. Why did you start Christians Against Christian Nationalism? And then what are you hearing from the people in the field that you're talking to and organizing?
Yeah. So as you noted, I lead the organization BJC, Baptist Joint Committee, and we have for nearly 90 years now brought a Baptist witness to the ideas and the challenges around religious freedom for all people and a commitment, a strong commitment to the separation of church and state. And so these issues that arise out of Christian nationalism really core to the mission of BJC. And you know, even more specifically, we came to see Christian nationalism or white Christian nationalism, and I'll use those terms interchangeably, as the single greatest threat to religious freedom for all people in the United States at this time. And so in 2019, really we gathered with ecumenical and at the time interfaith allies to discuss the extreme concerns we had about Christian nationalism and how it was becoming increasingly violent and even deadly at houses of worship. And we were thinking specifically about the shooting at Mother Emanuel AME Church, the violence and threats of violence in Charlottesville around the Unite the Right rally in the summer of 2017. And then in the fall of 2018, the shooting of the Tree of Life Synagogue, and felt a deep calling and a moral imperative to do something about it. And so starting, you know, at an interfaith table, we said, you know, we really think we need to draw attention to Christian nationalism, help people explain and understand what it is and how to recognize it and how to stand against it. And it was our interfaith friends, our Jewish and our Muslim friends, our Sikh friends, people from different traditions who agreed with us about the urgent problem of Christian nationalism, but also said with great kindness and with great clarity, you know, Christians, this is really mostly your problem to deal with. But because you've in many ways done the most to perpetuate it, but you can also speak with the most authenticity to your faith about how Christian nationalism is not an accurate rendering of the Christian religion, how it is a gross distortion of the teachings of Jesus and the Christian doctrine. And so we took their words to heart, and that was why we named the initiative Christians Against Christian Nationalism. And, as you know, when at the time, this was the summer of 2019, I wouldn't have envisioned exactly where the initiative would take us over the next 6 years. But I'm very grateful for the foresight of those people who we gathered in that coalition to start the campaign when we did. Because by the time January 6, 2021 came, the insurrection at the Capitol, when Christian nationalism was so clearly on display as a motivating factor in the violence and the attack on democracy, our initiative had already been going for 18 months. And so we had started to build a movement, but also the resourcing and the understanding around Christian nationalism that I think has allowed the initiative to both continue to grow the movement, but also pivot and adjust to the changing demands and now in 2025, the very urgent threats to pluralistic democracy and religious freedom that I think we're facing in the country today.
Yeah. It's so timely, and but it also is in many ways unrecognizable by the average person, the average Christian. You mentioned the January 6th riots, and the appeal to heaven flags that were flown, and the pictures of Jesus on flags that people were carrying who were actually trying to overthrow the government. So Christian nationalism is a threat to our democracy, but we don't sometimes recognize how it manifests. How do people of faith, particularly Christians, and people in general, recognize Christian nationalism in our country and more importantly, maybe in our churches?
Yeah, and I am often reminded, and I quote, just to start to answer your question, the words of James Baldwin. James Baldwin wrote, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed if it is not faced." Oh, hi.
Sorry to interrupt. Did either of you experience a lag or the video cutting in and out, or was that just me?
I think it was just you.
I did not.
I did not.
Okay. So hopefully that's, Joan, could you please just restate the question one more time? I just want to make sure that we have it and nothing gets left out. I'm so sorry to interrupt you guys.
No worries.
So, Amanda, you mentioned, the presence of Christian nationalism at the January 6th riot, and the flags, the appeal to heaven flags, for instance, and the pictures of Jesus on the flags that many people who were part of the insurrection were carrying with them. But regular, ordinary people, Christians, people in general, don't often recognize the signs of Christian nationalism. So how do we recognize not just in our country, but also in our churches, that Christian nationalism is present?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. It was really one of the motivating factors behind when we first started Christians Against Christian Nationalism. We were inspired in part by the words of James Baldwin, who wrote, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed if it is not faced." Right. And so in order to face the threat of Christian nationalism, we first have to understand what it is and learn to recognize it when we see it. And so I think as a starting point, I always start with definitions because I think it's important to have a common understanding about what we're talking about. And so I start with the definition of religious nationalism in general, which is a fusion of religious and national identities and goals, and recognize that religious nationalism has been a recurrent problem throughout history and around the world today. It is not unique to the United States of 2025. When we think about Christian nationalism, I think we can look all the way back to Constantine as a first example of the power of empire assuming the Christian religion on
Absolutely.
its own, and then using the power and the violence of the empire to impose Christianity on others. And we can look through history, through European history, the doctrine of discovery, using Christian theology as a justification for conquest and enslavement and violence, saying that it was God's will for European conquerors to steal native lands and to enslave people. We can look at history in the United States, since then. Times that Christian theology has been distorted, sometimes beyond recognition, in service of power. And we look around the world today too and see other examples of other countries with Christian nationalism or other countries with other kinds of religious nationalism. India, for instance, with Hindu nationalism. And so it's not uniquely American, but in the U.S. context, I define Christian nationalism, and we do at the campaign Christians Against Christian Nationalism, as a political ideology and a cultural framework that tries to merge American and Christian identities into one. Or put another way, that Christian nationalism suggests that to be a real American, to be fully American, that one has to be a Christian. And often not just any kind of Christian, but a Christian who holds fundamentalist religious beliefs that are often in line with conservative political priorities. And just to hold fundamentalist religious beliefs or just to have conservative political priorities, that doesn't necessarily mean that one's embracing Christian nationalism.
Right.
But to say to be a real American that you have to agree with those ideas, that does indicate Christian nationalism. And again, in the American context, Christian nationalism also, I think, cannot be understood apart from white supremacy, because Christian nationalism both creates and perpetuates a sense of cultural belonging that's limited to the people who held full rights of citizenship at the beginning of the nation. And that was a really small, narrow group of people. It was white, Protestant, Christian men who owned property. And everyone else, to different degrees, had fewer and fewer, not just rights, but also belonging in society. And Christian nationalism continues to tell the story that that's how it should be, that was God's will for this country, and that that's how we should continue to operate. And so I think kind of understanding those definitions, learning to see the markers of Christian nationalism. One of the markers is this heavy reliance on a mythological founding of the United States as a quote-unquote Christian nation, that is one founded by Christians in order to privilege Christianity in law and policy. It often is a cherry-picked version of American history. It really overemphasizes the religious biographies of the framers of the Constitution, for instance. And it even tries to sacralize the founding documents. Some extreme versions even claim that the founding documents were divinely inspired. It creates this idea of God's providential hand guiding the United States through history and into the present. And there's so many problems with this. One, it's really not in line with a more accurate and fulsome reading of American history, including constitutional history and text, a constitution that actually separated the institutions of church and state and says that the government won't take sides when it comes to religion. But it also has so many theological problems because it suggests, sometimes in subtle ways, sometimes in not so subtle ways, that God loves the United States best, that the Christians in the United States are the best kind of Christians, or that are the closest to what God's will for the world is. And that's in direct contradiction of the gospel. The gospel that says that God so loved the world, not that God so loved the United States or any other country. God doesn't make distinctions by nationality or ethnicity or race, but Christian nationalism does draw those lines of us versus them. So I think just like having some common understanding of and then to kind of recognize what it starts looking like. And you asked about like in our churches, and I think this is really incumbent upon Christians from all different denominations and aspects and all the beautiful expressions of Christianity. I think it's on us to really interrogate where and at what points in our history has our theology, our worship practices, our songs, our liturgies, where have they been corrupted by nationalism? Where have we been drawn away from the centrality of the Christian religion, which I believe is love? Where have we been drawn away from that love of God through love of neighbor towards this worship of power, a false idol of power? And where have we sacrificed or distorted the own message of the gospel and of the example of Jesus, and how we are to love God through love of neighbor?
Yeah.
To really interrogate that for ourselves and in our communities, that I think will prepare us for us to be able to see where it is in our broader society, and to advocate from a place of groundedness, grounded in our faith tradition, to be able to speak out, to say that's not a reflection of our faith, but it's also not a healthy marker for a pluralistic democracy.
Yeah, I think that's so correct. And I think about also how the political process, we are a country that is a two-party system. And so there's always, a rivalry. There's an us and a them in that framework. And I think about these days how often the kind of political struggle between the two parties is framed in the context of the kind of existential ultimate battle
Yeah.
that that we're engaged in, and that one side or the other side is evil, and that God is for one side and against the other side. So those two are also signs of this ideology of Christian nationalism, present both, in the Christian context, but also in our political environment.
Absolutely, and I think that's a wonderful point. In the especially some of the more extreme variations of Christian nationalism. I think that's an important point I want to make too. Is that
Yes.
I think about Christian nationalism on a spectrum, and there are some softer forms of Christian nationalism which are actually quite more prevalent in our society
Right.
than some of the more extreme and frankly dangerous ones, which are less prevalent, but also I think more dangerous in certain ways. So, some of the more commonplace ones, even things that just roll off the tongue, like "God bless America," right?
Or in God we trust.
Or in God we trust, right?
Yeah.
These ideas that try to again merge our religious and our national identities into one, to infuse a sense of patriotism with somehow wrapping that up in a certain kind of religious identity. Those are softer forms that I think we need to be attentive to, and really question some of the assumptions that are underlying those. But yes, some of those more extreme ones that would cast our political enemies as demonic, for instance. A lot of that language is used in certain strands or rhetoric, and that rhetoric is violent, because once we dehumanize our political enemies, then we are capable, or we kind of send a message that any kind of violence is then necessary in order to defend ourselves from these dehumanized elements. And so I think as Christians, we need to be really attentive to the language that we use and watch out for that violent rhetoric as well.
Yeah, I think, when we look at what is happening with deportations of immigrants in our country, that is also a pretty clear sign of the violence that surrounds this kind of rhetoric and Christian nationalist rhetoric.
Absolutely, and the rhetoric that's used by those who are advancing those deportations, they do use dehumanizing language in order to cast our immigrant neighbors as a threat, or as something that is as people that are less than human, right? And so that language is then we can also see how, again, these myths of America as a Christian nation, or this white supremacy, is also driving this sense that people who are immigrants somehow don't belong in this country, that must be excluded. So we see both the ideology, but also the mechanism of Christian nationalism and some of the tactics used at play in that particular urgent issue that's facing our country and our neighbors right now.
Yeah. Well, so clearly it seems that this ideology of Christian nationalism has been growing in our country over time. Just quickly, in your opinion, what is the tipping point at which Christian nationalism is beyond our ability to contain it? And, have we reached that point?
Yeah, I think a long look at history can be a helpful guide here. I've come to think about Christian nationalism as having various high tides throughout our history. And I definitely think we are at a high tide right now, but we can look back at other places where we've had high tides and where then the tide has receded, right? And so, so I do think, I guess, that there, my hope is that there isn't a point beyond which we cannot pull back as far as the ideology and it being present. And so when I think, for instance, just 100 years ago, I think about the KKK when it was a mainstream, popular group with millions of Americans. And it is just, I think, such a clear example of white Christian nationalism, using a distorted Christian theology and Christian symbols in order to justify racialized violence against not just Black Americans, but also Jewish Americans and Catholic Americans as well. And so I think we see that as a former place. Now, I think what makes the moment that we're in particularly perilous is we have this frontal assault on democratic institutions and on just the concept of a free and fair democracy, free and fair elections, pluralistic democracy. So if those structures fall and are unable to be kept, then I do think what I see is a move away from America's commitment to pluralistic democracy. I'll say it's a commitment that we've never fully realized. It's something that we are working towards continually, but we haven't quite reached it. And instead turning towards what looks like an authoritarian theocracy. And that's where I think when we get there, again, I don't think anything is unredeemable. I think we could still pull back, but it becomes much, much more difficult. And so I think that's what makes the moment that we're in so crucial, that while we still have, opportunities for civic engagement, where we do have opportunities for free and fair elections, where we have courts that are, for the most part, upholding due process of law. We're speaking today, right after this really awful decision from the U.S. Supreme Court that I think does make our constitutional order harder to hold. But I think we have to use every lever of pluralistic democracy that we have at our disposal while we still have it, and because the further and further we slip away, it becomes that much harder to pull back.
And I think that's a really clear statement of your belief that we can stop the spread of this, that we do have the power to do that. And in fact, your new book, How to End Christian Nationalism, has you naming very specific actions that we as individuals and communities can put into place to push back. So tell us what we need to know about how to end Christian nationalism.
So I wrote this book out of years of the work that I've been doing with so many others, trying to bring attention to Christian nationalism and meeting with groups and talking about it. And the number one question that I would get is, well, I agree that this is a problem, but it seems so huge and amorphous. And what can I do? What do we do about it? And so I just kept getting that question so many times. I thought, you know what? I think there might be some help for people who know enough to know that they want to end Christian nationalism to buy the book to say how to end it. You know, I'm writing to those people, you know, these are some concrete ideas of what to do. And so I've written the book, the chapters are steps. So each step, and, you know, there are 8 steps. 4 steps are a little bit more of internal work. You know, some of what we've been talking about here today, naming and understanding the threat of Christian nationalism, grounding ourselves in God's love, because I did, though this book is for anyone, I really was specifically writing to Christians, and even more specifically to white Christians, again, who I think bear the greatest responsibility in doing something about this. But grounding ourselves in God's love, denouncing violence, and committing to the separation of church and state. And then the second 4 steps are really to be done in community. How do we take on Christian nationalism close to home, whether it be in our congregations, in our churches, or in our families and in our neighborhoods? How do we have those hard conversations? I ask people to organize for change. To do the work that Network does already in so many different communities, but really bringing people together across all kinds of lines of difference to solve problems for their communities together. I ask people to particularly look at, you know, Christian nationalism shows up in so many different places, but one place that I think is pretty common across the country right now is in public schools. So ask people to commit to religious freedom in public schools that still educate, you know, 90% of American young people, that we really need to be concentrating there. And then finally, encouraging people to take their place in the public square. Because I think, especially in this moment, democracy becomes something that we practice. It's not just something that we have. And it's something we practice not just at the election booth, but every day. It's not just contacting our representatives, although that is absolutely an important piece of it, but it's getting involved in the life of our community, of showing up at the school board meetings and the city council meetings, of helping our neighbors, of understanding the needs and the challenges that our neighbors are facing, and being part of fashioning solutions. That vibrant civic society is so crucial in this moment, and should we slip further into autocracy, will be even more vital then. And so, you know, I'll kind of skip to the punchline of the book. You know, in the conclusion, I say, if you got this far, you'll know you're not going to end Christian nationalism just by reading a book, even this one, right? And it's honestly not going to be solved. We're not going to end it in my lifetime or yours. But these are our lives that we are given to steward and to live. And for our moment, I believe that we each have both an individual part, but a collective part to work together towards solutions, and really towards building a beloved community in which all of God's children thrive across, you know, there's no lines of distinction between us, that we all have an opportunity to have a flourishing life. And so, you know, that's my small piece that I'm trying to offer, is just some encouragement and some concrete ideas of what people can do.
Well, Amanda, this has been such an enlightening and emboldening conversation. I mean, you're leaving us on this with this sense of hope, really, that we can do something to stand up and to resist the spread of Christian nationalism, even though perhaps we won't end it in our lifetimes. But, you know, as people of faith, we have a responsibility, not just to ourselves today, but to our future communities, to our children and to children's children, to continue to perfect this union, and to continue to offer the freedoms that a democracy offers to everyone.
That's right.
So thank you so much for your work and for helping us to better understand the ideology of Christian nationalism. As I said, you've left us with concrete hope, and that it's not too late for our country, or for our Christian church for that matter, or for any organization of faith, congregation of faith. So thank you so much. And our profound thanks to you, Amanda Tyler. Don't forget, all of you out there listening, to look for her book, How to End Christian Nationalism. It's available wherever you get your books. Thanks,
Thank
Amanda.
you. Thanks so much.
Well, our profound gratitude to Amanda for helping us to be aware of what we can do as individuals and as communities to resist Christian nationalism. And of course, to Robbie and Brian for their contributions to this discussion about the threats that we face from Christian nationalism and fascism. And now I'd like to introduce my colleague and team lead of our grassroots mobilization team, Meg Olson, who will give us a call to action. Meg?
Yes, thank you so much, Joan, for just putting together this great event, this wonderful dialogue, and to Father Brian and Dr. Jones and Amanda Tyler for joining us today, and to Robbie Pentecost for leading us in such a beautiful prayer. So friends, we have learned so much from this conversation, and indeed, as many of you put in the comments, the alarm has been sounded. So now it's time to put our faith into action. We are at a moral moment right now as the Senate debates and votes this weekend on the budget reconciliation bill that will strip millions of people from healthcare, food, and other critical programs. The next days will determine whether so many we love and care for have the essential support they need to thrive in dignity. The network community has made over 1,000 calls this week. Sisters have come to the Hill. Our members and supporters in Cleveland and Philly have been out on the streets, and we are going to be at the Capitol all weekend. So what I'm asking you is to keep the calls coming. The Senate is in all weekend, so call today and tomorrow, and invite your friends and family to call too. The Budget Reconciliation Toolkit is right on our website, networklobby.org. And it has the call-in number and it has a script, as well as so many other helpful resources for this moment. So right after this, go to networklobby.org and download our Budget Reconciliation Toolkit. And when the bill is back in the House later this week, we will let you know and equip you to make those calls too to your member of Congress. As Dr. Jones said, we are the ones who bend the arc, so it's go time. And finally, we know that one of the strongest antidotes to authoritarianism is organizing. And so today, as the director of the team, my wonderful team that organizes Catholics and justice seekers across the country, I am asking you to support our work by becoming a member of Network. Membership is $50 a year or $20 for students and folks living on fixed income. So after you are on our website to get the toolkit, click on Become a Member, and please become a member today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Meg. And friends, we have come to the end of another significant and enlightening and timely conversation. I hope that you have much to reflect upon and to take away from this discussion today. It's good to hear that some of you think that the warning lights are shining bright and you're getting the message. So thanks to Amanda, thanks to Dr. Robert Jones, and thanks to Father Brian Massengale. I just want to, as we close, mention a couple of things. If we have learned anything in these last 150 plus days, it is that no one, no institution is going to save us. Meg just told us that clearly. We, the people, must save ourselves. And the good news is we can do it if we work together, if we act in solidarity with one another as sisters and brothers, all created with inherent dignity and all worthy of thriving. We can reject the theological distortions of Christian nationalism. We can say a resounding no to fascism as a form of governance. We can reclaim the values of our Christian faith and reinforce the common good values of all faith traditions. We can reach out across lines of politics and faiths and communities, generations, and all other differences, and we have the power to advance a vision of democracy that is pluralistic, equitable, and welcoming of all. The future really is in our hands, and we have said this many, many times before. It is our choice to make, and history is calling each of us and all of us to make the right decision today. But it will take clear vision and moral courage. It's up to us to protect, promote, and expand our democracy for today and for the future of our country. It's up to us as Christians to reclaim our religious values and faith traditions. Remember, we the people have the power. Let us use that power wisely. Thank you again for being with us this afternoon. Huge thanks to our sponsors as well. Be sure to share what you have learned with others, and check out Robbie Jones' new book, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future, as well as Amanda Tyler's book, How to End Christian Nationalism. Both are available, as we said earlier, wherever you get your books. And another quick reminder, everyone who is registered will receive a link to today's recording. And please go to our website, www.networklobby.org, for more information on this and other ways to become involved. Share it widely. Have a wonderful weekend, everyone, and be well.